Fox Sports. RJ Young back with us here on Big Ten Today. RJ, how you doing? Thanks for the time.
I'm good, fellas. Appreciate you for having me.
Well, we appreciate the time and lots to talk about here. College football playoff expansion conversation has really picked up in the last couple of weeks. Is this inevitable, RJ? I mean, if anybody that's against this, are you kind of going upstream on this? Are we going to have that expansion here before too long?
Hey, man, last December, I had a T-shirt custom made that says, "Expand the playoff, you cowards," because that's exactly what I've always wanted. And I think now you're seeing people that are coming around to my way of thinking on this, not just because it makes the game, I think, a little bit more competitive and gets more teams an opportunity to say, A, we made the playoff, and B, give you an opportunity to go win a national championship. And I think that when you take into account 11,000 FBS players, the idea that you're going to tell half of them that they're not good enough to compete for championships because they don't play in an autonomous 5 is ludicrous and stupid, right? And then there's this other, I think, really important piece. You expand the playoff, you create more revenue, you create more inventory, more people get to experience the game, and you unite the nation under one common cause that is a playoff bracket, as opposed to what's going on in the Pacific Northwest or what's going on in the Southeast, right? I want to know that the SEC, the Pac-12 are all represented in the same pie. You get your group of 5 champions in, you get your autonomous 5 champions in, and let's see who the best of the best is. If that means Alabama's got to beat up on North Texas, fine. But every now and again, North Texas is going to stun you, and that's what's going to make this great.
RJ, with the college football expansion inevitable, how many teams do you think that when they do expand from 4, how many do you think they'll go to? Do you think it'll be, I would say, an upward sliding scale, like go from 4 to 8, and then possibly the end game maybe being 12 down the road? Or will it only be one change and how many teams?
You know, I think that the number is 24 for me. Though what I think they're going to stop at is 12. But the reason that I point to 24 is because they got a 24-team playoff in the FCS, and there are fewer teams in that division than there are in the FBS. And since it works at the FCS level, why wouldn't it work at the FBS level? Like if you go to 16 teams, you know, I think you get the same thing in, right? You get your 10 conference champions in, and then you can get your 6 at-large berths, which I think is also a happy medium. I think when you go to 6, you go to 8, you go to 12, you're always going to leave out a team that probably should have a chance to get beat. I'll give you an example. Going into the bowl season last year, not the playoffs, we had San Jose State undefeated, Cincinnati undefeated, Coastal Carolina undefeated, right? And then that's before we get to our Power 5 champions who are undefeated. I think in the sport, the hardest thing to do is to run the table. And I think you should have an opportunity to play until someone beats you. And what better way to do that than in a playoff? And you can also fold the bowls in there if that's something you want. I'm not a bowl guy. I'm also born in 1987, so they don't mean that much to me in the first place.
So in terms of, let's go with your, view, 24. The first response that people are going to have, and you've heard it 1,000 times like Jay and I have, now you are watering down the regular season. RJ, what do you say to that side of that discussion?
No, you're not, because the regular season wasn't all that important to begin with. And I can't wait to see Alabama line up across from New Mexico State. Yeah, okay, sure. I can't wait to see Oklahoma play Missouri State. Yeah, okay, sure. Now, what I think you also are going to actually do is make the regular season a little bit more entertaining, because now teams will have an incentive to go and schedule games we want to see without it affecting how we're going to feel about voting them into a college football playoff scenario. I would love to see these teams take on difficult schedules. You go 8-5, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? You get into the playoff if you win your conference championship. I also look at it from the standpoint of, how would we not want to see Georgia Clemson every year, right? What if we could do that? What if we could see Ohio State, Oregon every year? Yeah, and then you don't have to worry about, man, that's really going to hurt us in the college football playoff rankings. The stupidest thing about our sport is that we allow people in suits in boardrooms to decide who's good, as opposed to the scoreboard. I hate that. The idea that Toledo wins 35 straight games from 67 to 70 and gets no higher than 7th in the AP poll is stupid to me. Let that team play. If they're good, they're good. That'll bear out. If not, fine. But in regard to the regular season, no. Give Ohio State every opportunity to schedule somebody we want to see them play as opposed to putting a cupcake on the schedule to protect their undefeated record.
You definitely have valid points. Well, RJ, I want to ask you a question as far as like the bowl games, the number of bowl games. I think for years, I think it got to the peak of almost around 40 bowl games. If and when, I guess, obviously they expand the playoffs, do you think that number will go down? And then how will it affect the bowl games? And what I mean by that is for the teams that don't make the playoffs, right, to make whether it's 24 or 12, however many teams that they have, how will they up the ante on these bowl games that all the other teams are going to and not water it down? Because as much as people will argue saying if 24 teams is going to water down the product, this many bowl games is also the same kind of argument. It's watered down the bowl game season as well.
We got damn near 40 bowl games now, right? And we have more bowl games sometimes than we got teams that are eligible to play in them, okay? I don't think that we live in a world where you're going to have folks going, I can't afford to put on a bowl game and find teams to get into my bowl game. That's not going to happen. The other reason is because you did the proliferation of the bowl games with the Bowl Alliance. And since we go back to the 80s, right, when the University of Oklahoma led a lawsuit to the NCAA to say, hey, we want to negotiate our own television contracts, if there is an appetite for games, and there is because it's college football, you're going to find teams to play in those bowl games. And as far as the bowl system, I'm not a fan of it because it's no longer a thing that you aspire to. It used to be, you played your Big Ten season, your Pac-12 season, Pac-10, to get to the Rose Bowl. But now, when you know you can go 5-7 and make a bowl game because you travel well, what does that actually mean? It doesn't mean anything. It means that you got to go through a couple of weeks of actual practice, and you got to get ready for a game that ain't going to sell out in a venue that sucks. No, I don't think that that's going to go anywhere because there are people that stand to make money from it. And as long as people stand to make money from something, they're going to keep doing it. What I think you're going to do is protect the integrity of the sport, if nothing else, by eliminating some of those bowl games and putting more emphasis into saying, did you win on the football field? Because if you won on the football field, you're probably playing in the playoff that is 24 teams.
RJ Young from Fox Sports with us here on Big Ten Today. You mentioned money, and you mentioned a little earlier about revenue, and we all know how much more that would bring in if we expand the college football playoff. Do you think this conversation has picked up some steam in the last week or so, RJ, because of what happened last year, because of the pandemic, because of the lost revenue? That's what's driving this conversation a little harder right now, in your mind?
I don't think you can discount that by any means, right? I think that everybody hurt in 2020. But I also think, when we see the playoff the way that it was, and we all were looking at it going, Notre Dame's going to get beat like a drum, why not just put another team in there that's never been there before? And then you have that conversation around expanding because Cincinnati shows up and they're like, yo, what do we got to do? What do we have to do to get into this playoff? The same thing that Central Florida said a few years ago when they said, we went undefeated and we won a national championship. One, because they were voted number one in at least one of the polls that the NCAA recognizes in crowning a national championship, but also because they finished the season undefeated. Now, I also understand that you're going to find ways to increase your revenue, and the best way to increase your revenue in regard to college sports is to have a damn good football team and to play a bunch of football games, particularly at home. What if one of those playoff games was hosted by the home team? Yeah, that's a big deal. To say nothing of the conferences all make money depending on how their teams perform in the postseason. So if the Big 12, for instance, gets a team into the playoff this year, the conference makes more money. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I wish that so much of this wasn't driven by money, but we live in a capitalistic system. That's what's going to be driving the conversation.
Speaking of, obviously, big-time wins, big coaches, and big money, one of the questions I want to have or ask you is, in your opinion, what coach is on the hottest hot seat in college football in 2021?
Man, it's a difficult question to answer because I tried to give everybody a mulligan last year, and yet there were still folks that managed to get fired. I don't know about being on a hot seat, but I would say that we're all expecting them to perform this year, and I'm going to look at USC. I think that the way that USC ended its season, playing in the Pac-12 championship game and then not winning it, losing to an Oregon team that got beat like they stole something by Iowa State, you want to see what they return. And then you add in there, they bring in 3 Texas transfers. Keontae Ingram at running back, Xavier Alford at safety, and Malcolm Epps at tight end. You return Keaton Slovis at wide receiver. You got a great quarterback, You got a great receiving core with Brew McCoy leading that. And I really like what they're doing on defense with Todd Orlando. I want to see Clay Helton break through. That's what I want. I want to see him win a Pac-12 championship and get them into the playoff, if at all possible. I also think that this is a magic year, right, for Mario Cristobal in Oregon. So if he goes into Columbus and comes out with a W, yeah, expect them to crown him. But in as far as somebody getting fired, nah, I don't know who that might be, and I don't want to be right about it.
Well, here in the Big Ten, as you well know, the hot seat conversation always points itself to Ann Arbor and to Jim Harbaugh. Do we try to pump the brakes on that this year, given the contract extension up there, or is that seat still warm up there for Harbaugh?
You know, that's a very good name, and it's a very good way to put it, because I looked at how Jim Harbaugh's extension was mapped out, and I got to say, University of Michigan got a W there, because you're only paying the man if he performs. If he doesn't, you're going to pay him less than you used to. I don't think he's on a hot seat because they know they're getting him at a bargain, and they know that he's now in it. Like, he knows he has to perform. He has to meet certain benchmarks for him to get the kind of money that he had first signed on to make. I don't think of that as a hot seat. I think that the University of Michigan is going to ride Jim Harbaugh's contract out as long as they can. Short of going, 4 and whatever, I think that he's fine.
Speaking of coaches, what team do you think, whether it's Michigan or a team like that, or Auburn, that's going to rebound from a slow or bad 2020?
I'm looking at Minnesota and Penn State. I think Penn State a little bit more than Minnesota, if for no other reason than I really liked Mike Yurcich, and I got to see him up close at Oklahoma State do some outstanding things offensively. Perhaps he's the guy that can whisper into Sean Clifford's ear and turn them into a world beater there, because it feels like Penn State is going to have an opportunity to contend in what I think is a loaded division. I mean, short of the SEC West, you're talking about the Big Ten East being the best division in all of football, from Ohio State to Indiana stepping up. Rutgers ain't going to be no pushover. Michigan State's going to be all right. Penn State's in the middle of that, and then Michigan, of course. So I'm looking at those, but also Minnesota could come out of the Big Ten West and surprise some folks, right? Like, if they are able to get past Wisconsin and Tanner Morgan ends up being that dude, they find a replacement for Rashad Bateman, they're going to be pretty good. So those are the 2 teams I'm looking at.
Is the gap any closer from the rest of the Big Ten to Ohio State this year for you, even though there's going to be a new quarterback in Columbus, or is it still pretty wide, RJ?
Pretty awesome question, right? Because there's a different way to look at that, which is to say none of the Ohio State quarterbacks have ever thrown a pass in college, like, period. But they are inheriting a Ferrari on offense. Like, at every position, Ohio State is loaded, but you also know that they still got to fix that defense, particularly the secondary. And I look around and I say, yeah, Indiana closed, right? Indiana was in that game up until the end, and we obviously didn't get to see the game last year. So I think people are closing the gap on Ohio State, but it's still very much their conference, right? And until somebody can beat them in the Big Ten East, I don't see anybody that can really thump them in the Big Ten West, though Northwestern got close, right? When you look at what Northwestern was able to do in frustrating Justin Fields and that offense, you got to give it up to Pat Fitzgerald and them. So defensively, I think people are finding ways, and that's what it's going to take to beat Ohio State. We're not used to seeing them giving up what they did on the back end, and maybe Kerry Combs fixes that. But I think it's closing, and that's going to be a lot of fun if somebody can actually jump up and bite Ohio State in 2021.
Speaking of the Big Ten West, in real short, can you give me 2 teams that you're looking to come out of the Big Ten West?
Yeah, I'll go with Minnesota, and I'll go with Wisconsin. Both of those return starting quarterbacks, and I'm a big believer in having a returning starting quarterback to lead your offense and your football team. So I'll go with those 2. We'll see what happens in that game when they play.
All right. Great stuff, RJ. We very much appreciate the time. Of course, we'll be checking you out at Fox Sports and catch you down the road here on Big Ten Today. Thanks for stopping by.
Appreciate you guys. Have a good afternoon.